This morning we are going to be continuing our Mind Game series, and it's my pleasure to introduce Jason Perkins. So coming up, dude. You may have seen Jason around the place. He is the director of the Irresistible Churches Network that Lifepoint is a part of, and technically you come to Lifepoint.
Technically, this is my home church, and technically I'm good at feedback, so I'm going to step back a little bit. Okay, how's that? Is that better? There we go.
But
Yeah, technically
you
this is my home church, Greg. I come to the 5 o'clock though, typically. That's what everyone says when they don't attend church very often.
Because I'm pretty sure we talked before about the 5 o'clock service tonight. You're going to come.
That I come to the 9:30.
Yes.
So yeah. No, I get to come about once a quarter, which I think is good for church attendance. But don't tell Dan that when he comes back, okay? Make sure that he's not aware of my attendance pattern. So
cool.
Yeah, it's great to be here this morning.
Thanks.
Would you give Greg a big round of applause for emceeing today? As Greg said, my name's Jason, and when I travel and speak in other parts of the world, I have to explain my nickname Perko, but in Australia, people just figure it out that we Australians, we love to butcher the English language. So they took my last name Perkins and they just cut it in half and put an O on the end, and I've been called Perko my whole life. So if you want to call me Perko, feel free to do that. Most people don't even know what my actual name is. My wife, Kristen, is with me today, which is a big treat for me because my wife and I are newly empty nesters as of January this year. Any other empty nesters in the room this morning? That's the group of people that have no clue that there are even school holidays happening right now. We are clueless about the entire concept of school calendars now, and we absolutely love that season of life, to be honest with you. We love our children, but we love empty nesting even more. It's amazing. So, hey, I am a former PE teacher by profession, which means I'm not that great at public speaking, but I'm really good at blowing a whistle. I have a 4-year degree in whistleblowing, and so I love playing games. It's like the PE teacher in me just can't not play games. So I would love to start this morning by playing a game with you, and if you are able, this is a game where you actually have to stand. So if you're able, would you do me a favor? Would you stand with me for a moment? And we're going to play a game called Face Off. Face Off is a very simple game. In fact, I think I may have played it here at Lifepoint once before, at least maybe in the evening service. And simply, the game is a game where you just put a couple of images up on the screen, and there's a question or a theme to the question or the images, and you as the audience have to pick which of the two images you think is correct for that particular theme. The theme of this Face-Off game edition this morning is what you should be worried about, okay? That's the theme of the game this morning, which I'm assuming now you're thinking 9:30 in the morning. I'm so glad I came to church to find out what I should be worried about. It's going to be over in about 5 minutes. It'll be great. So I want to give you the first round of this kind of what I should be worried about Face-Off edition. I'm going to give you the first round as a grace round, kind of a practice round. But the rest of the game of Face-Off, it's actually a game of elimination. So if you don't get the answer correct, you have to sit down and you're eliminated from the game completely, all right? It's not for every generation. There are some generations that think everyone should get a trophy. This is not one of those games. Be careful. You may be laughing and you may be a part of that generation, okay? So the first round is a practice round. There's a lot of grace. This is a bad church joke, but after the first round, unlike Jesus' grace, it's over. Doesn't keep going. Jesus' grace goes on. So let's bring up the first image or the first set of images. When it comes to what you should be worried about with your health, okay? Which of these two drinks should you worry about drinking more than the other one, okay? One of them is more healthy than the other, and you need to decide which one you should be more worried about when drinking, okay? If you think that tea, you should be worried more about drinking tea than coffee, you're going to face this direction, okay? If you think you should be more worried about drinking coffee than tea, you're going to face this direction. If you're still facing me, after I count down from 3 and we show the answer, then you would be eliminated from the game, okay? That's how it works. And if you get it wrong, you'll be eliminated from the game as well. Now, some of you may be even wondering right now, Why should I even be bothered playing this stupid game? Okay, and that's a valid question. I think the only reason you should participate in this game is because the winner is going to get a favorites, box of favorites, okay, which they can keep for themselves or share amongst friends, all right? All right, so let's do this. On the count of three, first round, 3, 2, 1. The answer is coffee, all right? So if you were still facing me or if you were facing T, you would have been eliminated, all right? But that's a practice round. Now this one is for all the chocolates, okay? Next round, we'll bring up the next set of... Okay, when it comes to transport, percentages of safety, is it better off to drive? Should I be more worried about driving or should I be more worried about flying, okay? Which one should I be more worried about? Driving or flying, okay? And again, I'm going to give you 3 seconds to make a decision. If you're still facing me, you'll be out in 3, 2, 1. The answer is driving, okay? Was there anyone still facing me or facing flying? If you were, you must be seated at this point, all right? Okay, those two were kind of gimmies. You should have gotten those ones, all right? Let's up the ante a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. Skydiving or bungee jumping? Which one should I be more worried about? When it comes to like safety, risk, which one should I worry about more? Is it skydiving or bungee? You know how the game works. You have 3 seconds now. In 3, 2, 1. The answer is skydiving. All right. So all the bungee people, you need to take a seat. Wow. Okay, so this section of the crowd doing pretty well. The middle section doing decent. This section over here, you've got to pick up your game. All right, we've got to pick up the game. All right, next round, getting a little bit more difficult. Oh, when it comes to snakes around the world, which one should you be more worried about? Okay, now the inland taipan, native Australian snake here in Australia, and the black mamba, found in many parts of Africa, which one do you think you should be more worried about than the other? Okay, which is more risky, which is more deadly? So we've got the inland taipan people facing this way, the black mamba people facing this way, and the answer in 3, 2, 1 is black mamba. Now listen. Every time I do one of these games, there's some person in the crowd that after the service comes up to me, well, actually, the black mamba, and I'm like, listen, okay, the black mamba's venom is not as deadly as the inland taipan. The inland taipan is the most deadly venom in the world. However, it's a recluse snake that never gets around people, and the black mamba is much more aggressive, which makes it a much greater risk. So that's my explanation, and I'm sticking to it. All right, next round. Next round. All right. When it comes to eating healthy, thinking of your health, worried about your nutrition, which one should you be more worried about when eating? Should you be more worried about eating McDonald's? You'll face that way. Should you be more worried about eating Hungry Jack's? You'll face this way. Which one should you be more worried about when you're eating healthy? All right? And we're going to reveal the answer in just a moment. Everyone's made their decision. One lady down the front still toying with the decision. Temporary indecision down the front here. All right. In 3, 2, 1, the answer is both of them. And that, by the way, is just an old PE teacher's trick of ending a game and not having to give away a prize. So you're all eliminated from the game. Actually, this lady here, I think you were thinking they were both horrible. And so I'm going to give you something very nutritious. Give her a big round of applause. Feel free to keep those to yourself or share them amongst friends. Do whatever you would like to. I think you'll probably have a lot of friends after the service now, though. Hey, when it comes to things to worry about, there are a lot of things in the world that you could be worried about, and I'm sure you're probably really grateful at this point going, I'm so glad I came to church. I just learned a bunch of things that I should be worried about that I wasn't worried about before. Thanks so much. But today we're talking about things that people oftentimes worry about, and worry tends to lead to something else that has actually become quite an epidemic in our culture and in our society today. And I think it's important for us as a church to talk about these issues of worry, which oftentimes lead to anxiety. I want to put up a list of things that people typically worry about on the screen. Here's kind of a classic list of things that people find themselves worrying about: their health, finances, maybe their family, relationships, career. Maybe it's the future, social acceptance, time management, failure, all sorts of things. Even safety, like some of the things we put on the screen earlier. And even the idea of the meaning of life or purpose is something that people find themselves oftentimes worrying about. Worry often leads to this thing called anxiety. And here's what I've discovered through doing a little bit of research and also being married to somebody that works in the mental health field. I've discovered that in Australia, we have actually found ourselves in a time in culture and society where anxiety is at an all-time high. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, a couple of years ago, during 2020 to 2022, did a study of mental health and well-being across Australia. And I want to share with you just a few of the things that they discovered in this research. The first thing, we'll bring it up on the screen, is that 42.9% of people aged 16 to 85 years had experienced a mental disorder at some time during their lifetime. So it may not just be kind of low-level anxiety, but this is like almost half of the population said, I have experienced some sort of mental disorder in my lifetime, in that age category. The second thing that the survey or the research discovered is that 21.5% of people had a 12-month, a year-long mental disorder, with anxiety being the most common group within those mental disorders. So that's 1 in 5 Australians struggling with anxiety within that group. And then finally, they discovered this, that 38, nearly 40% of people aged 16 to 24 years had a 12-month mental disorder, some sort of mental disorder that had lasted for a year or more. Not to mention those of us in the room that would say, hey, it hasn't been a year-long challenge or battle with anxiety, but the reality is now they're saying more than 90% of Australian adults struggle with some sort of form of anxiety in their life. That's 9 out of 10 Australians. And you may be wondering then, why is this such a big deal? Why is it such a big deal? And I would just say it's a big deal because it's something that every single one of us, no matter how old we are, how young we are, doesn't matter whether you're married or single, whether you'd call yourself a church person or not a church person, all of us have some sort of struggle when it comes to anxiety in our lives. That's why I think it's such a big thing to talk about. I'm so grateful that in a country like Australia where we live, not only do we talk about it like in church, but we also talk about it in the public domain. You may be aware of the fact that this past Thursday was actually Are You OK Day? And I love the fact that the campaign now is saying it should be Are You OK Day any day. Every day should be a day that you should be able to ask the question, hey, how are you doing? Are you okay? Are you struggling with something? So I want to invite you just to look at the list again on the screen. And I want to tell you the 5 that I most commonly find myself worrying about. This is Perko's kind of group therapy this morning, okay? So I'm just going to be open and honest with you about the things that I tend to worry about. Number 1, health. For me is one of the things. Finances I worry about. My family, my wife and I love being empty nesters, but that means I worry about my kids more than I ever have because I don't see them as often. And then I worry about the future, not just my future and my wife's future, but the future of our family and the future of our friends. I worry about time management a lot. I have quite a busy schedule, and so I worry about my calendar quite a bit of the time. Those are my top 5 areas that I tend to find myself gravitating towards when it comes to worry. So I've kind of gone first this morning with this group therapy thing. And so here's what I'd like to invite you to do. And this may be a bit of a stretch. Like Greg asked you to chat about what you were going to do over the school holidays a moment ago. That's a pretty easy one. Here's what I'd love for you to do. And some of you may say, Jason, that's just not for me, and that's okay. But if you're willing, I would love for you to pick one of the things on that list, or maybe it's a different item on the list. And I'd love for you to turn to your neighbor. I'm going to give you just a minute to turn to your neighbor and say, hey, out of all the things that are on that list, if I'm being brutally honest with myself, this is the one that I probably tend to worry about if I was going to worry. Or maybe you're part of that 10% that doesn't worry. Just humor me and pick one off the list anyway, okay? But if you're part of the 90%, be honest with your neighbor, the person around you, maybe somebody behind you or in front of you, and just say, hey, on that list of 10, here's the one that I probably have a tendency to worry about the most. All right, go ahead and turn to your neighbor and share that one with them if you would now. All right. What I'm going to do now, if I can grab your attention, here's what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to walk around with the microphone and have you share with everybody else what's the thing that you're just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Some of you are like really worried right then that Jason was being serious. He was going to bring the microphone to you. Actually, I'm going to invite my wife, Kristen, to come up. My wife is a counselor, and would you welcome Kristen to the stage? My wife is a counselor, and prior to starting her own counseling practice, she actually worked with children in this kind of mental health space. And you would say that anxiety, at the end of the day, it ain't all bad. That's probably not the best way to describe it, but anxiety isn't all bad. There's some pros to it. In fact, there's some things that can help us stay in safe places and so on. But you have a great way, I think, of explaining some of the science around how God has created us with this idea of anxiety and why it's not all bad. And then I'd love for you to tell us when it can be getting into that realm of not being helpful, and what would you recommend as a counselor, some ways that you can help to overcome that?
Sure. So anxiety often tends to start from our environments, and we're not always in control of our environments, but that environment then triggers a thought, and then that thought triggers a behavior. And often we get stuck in the thought. So I often teach kids about their brain, and there's two really important parts of the brain that you have to think of. Lots of parts of the brain, but two really important parts. So if you think of your brain this way.
In fact, let's have everybody just put your hand up like that with your thumb in front, just like that. Yeah.
So this part of your brain right here, this is your wise eagle, okay? It's your prefrontal cortex. It helps you think logically, make decisions, have goals and aspirations. This is the really strong, healthy part of our brain, and is big. This part of our brain right here is the guard dog. It alarms us when we're in danger. And often when we get triggered by a thought, and that thought creates a behavior, our wise eagle covers up the amygdala. It's called this little tiny, tiny little thing in our brain. It's so small, it's like the size of a nut. It's so powerful. And often we get stuck in a thought. And so sometimes, like I would explain to the students I would work with, like if the school alarm, fire alarm goes off, everyone starts to panic and they're stuck. They're thinking there's a fire. But actually it was just a fire drill. There's no smoke, there's no fire engines. It's just a fire drill. And so we have to learn how to slowly relax our brain and turn off the emotional brain and turn on the thinking brain. So some ways that you can do it is deep breathing. That's the number one thing that we tell everyone to do. Another practice is mindfulness, and the one that I am most passionate about because I'm a counselor is talking it through with people.
So good. Hey, would you do me a favor? Would you thank Kristen for giving us a quick little lesson on the science of the brain there? So the amygdala, this little tiny nut, almond-sized part of our brain, is really the thing that kind of triggers anxiety. It's why some of you, the moment you saw the skydiving versus bungee jumping thing, you started to get nervous, and maybe your prefrontal cortex like covered the amygdala and you were feeling like you were just stuck. That's what's happening scientifically in our bodies, biologically, when we begin to experience anxiety. What I find fascinating is that the social sciences today that are helping people to overcome anxiety are actually aligning, I would say this, they are catching up with what the Bible has said about anxiety for over 2,000 years. I find it fascinating that social scientists today are saying, here are the things that you need to do in order to overcome anxiety. So I want to take us back about 2,000 years, actually. I want to take us back this morning to the first century, to a little letter that was written by a guy named Paul, who found himself actually in prison in Rome. Imagine that for a moment. In fact, there's a kind of an image on the screen of Paul writing a letter to some people living in Philippi in the first century. Of all the places in the world for your amygdala to trigger a flight or fight response, I think it would be a Roman prison. And so Paul, in that setting, actually gives us some ideas, gives us some truths that help us to overcome anxiety, not just in the first century, but I believe it's relevant for us in 2024 today. Now, some of you maybe are not Bible people. You'd say like, hey, I'm not sure if I believe all of the things in the Bible yet, kind of on a journey, or maybe you're kind of checking out church, or maybe you just showed up today because somebody told you there's really cute girls that come to this church, and you're like, hey, I should go check that place out. I have no idea how you landed here this morning, but I want to encourage you just for a few minutes, go with me and see if what the scriptures, what the Bible has to say about anxiety, what the Bible has to say matches up or aligns with what social scientists are saying with the epidemic that we're in today with anxiety in Australia. So let me begin by just sharing with you the first thing that Paul says about anxiety. This is what he says to begin in the letter. He says this: do not be anxious about anything. Of which I think to myself, what planet were you living on, Paul? Don't be anxious about anything. You're in a Roman prison. You're attached to a Roman guard who every 8 hours they would bring in a new Roman guard and attach that person to Paul. The entire time he's there, he's attached to a Roman guard. And his first idea around anxiety is this: don't be anxious about anything. And I'm thinking to myself, well, surely Paul's going to give some sort of like really helpful information after this statement. He goes on to say this: don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, and this is really important for us to understand, not only is Paul saying, hey, don't be anxious when things are going really poorly, but Paul is also saying, hey, even when things are going really well, I want to encourage you, don't be anxious during that time. And then Paul goes on to say this. He says, but in every situation, notice these words, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Now, immediately when I read that, I think to myself, why is Paul separating a couple of these things out? Because when I first read, but by prayer and petition, immediately the question comes to my mind, Paul, what did you know about prayer that I don't know about today? Because when I think about prayer, I think petition is a part of prayer. In fact, maybe you've never really been taught to pray before, and you've kind of thrown up a prayer to God. Most of us, when we begin praying and we begin the idea of prayer, we actually start off with this concept of petition. That's where we start when it comes to prayer. The natural prayers that we pray, even when we've never been taught to pray, oftentimes come through a petition or a request. Think for a moment when you're driving around Westfield at North Lakes, especially at Christmas time, and you're desperately trying to find a car spot to park. And even if you're not a praying person, all of a sudden you find yourself saying, God, if you're out there, is it possible you could open up a spot for me to be able to park? See, we begin our prayer life, even as young children, even as adults, we begin with this idea that prayer is a way in which we send requests, we make petitions to God. But what I've discovered is this: prayer is so much more than just petition. Prayer is so much more than just sending up requests to God. In fact, I came across a beautiful book. It's called The Interior Castle. It's written by a 16th century Carmelite nun who talks about different stages of prayer. I want to unpack for you the 4 stages of prayer that St. Teresa of Avila, she describes when it comes to prayer. We'll bring them up on the screen. She says that when it comes to prayer, we oftentimes start off by just talking at God. That's sending up the petition in the car park saying, God, I'd really love to be able to find a parking spot. And then as we progress in our prayer life, we move from just asking God to do things for us to actually talking to God and maybe even having a conversation with God. That's kind of the next progression she would describe as prayer. But then she says that as you move along in your progression of prayer, she says you begin to actually stop to listen to what God wants to say to you. And here's what I've discovered over the last few years. As I've begun to practice a practice I'm going to share with you in just a moment, I've discovered that you can then begin to move not from just talking to God or listening to God, but you can be very content and satisfied simply just being with God. Not having to have a conversation, but just simply being with God. When my wife and I were first married, I remember we would talk a lot. We'd have a lot of conversations. In fact, before we were married, I remember texting her and having conversations with her. And some of you remember these days as well when you'd call each other on the phone and you would be talking late at night and you'd have really nothing to talk about, but you just keep talking. And then finally somebody would say, well, I really need to go to sleep now. And they were like, you hang up first. You know, the old thing. And you're like, no, you hang up first. And you're really not talking about anything, but you just love spending time together. And then some of the older people in the room, you've experienced some of this, you can go for hours and hours on a drive together and enjoy the time together without having to say much of anything. Because you've been together so long, you just enjoy being in each other's presence. That's exactly what Teresa of Avila would say is kind of the highest form or the greatest progression when it comes to prayer. So what does that have to do with anxiety? Well, here's what I believe it has to do with anxiety. When you begin to move from not just petitioning God, but actually being with Him and enjoying just being in His presence, I've discovered that it has an incredible ability to help reduce the anxiety in your life. In fact, one of the ways that I began to work through this progression, we'll go to the next slide, is this simple practice of silence in my life. A lot of social scientists would call it mindfulness. I just call it the practice of silence, where I just simply pause moments, different moments throughout the day. I pick a phrase or a word that I'm going to focus on when I'm sitting in silence, just me and Jesus together. I close my eyes and I'll just contemplate who God is. I won't even speak or say anything, but I'm just sitting there in silence, focusing on that word or phrase. When my mind begins to wander and think about the things of that day or what I'm worried about, I just gently remind myself of that word or that phrase and refocus my attention on soaking in God's love for me. This has been probably the practice that has had the single greatest impact on my progression of prayer, moving from talking to God or talking with God to simply being content being with God. And here's what Paul says is the benefits of this kind of prayer. Paul goes on to say this in the next part of the verse. He says, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, notice it says, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Not only does this type of prayer help to guard your heart, but he says specifically, this is the kind of prayer that will begin to guard your mind as well. So I want to encourage you to consider just developing a practice of mindfulness or focused prayer where you're not talking to God, but you're actually just content being with God. Here's a rhythm that I've put together. We'll go to the next slide there. This is a rhythm that I've just put together for my own walk with Jesus that has been so helpful for me. I've just simply decided, hey, a few moments of the day, in the morning, in the afternoon, evening, and then before I go to bed, I'm just going to pause to be still and quiet and silent before the Lord. I'm actually going to give you an opportunity to grab a copy of this a little bit later on. But I want you to just think about the benefits of what it would look like if I were to begin to practice the silence and presence of Jesus in my life. Again, I find it fascinating that what the scripture has been saying for years is the same thing that social scientists are discovering today. It said in that verse that the peace of God that transcends all of our understanding will guard your hearts and your mind. There's a part of the social science that I don't fully understand, so I'm kind of speaking above my pay grade at this moment, that talk about this idea of neuroplasticity. It's a fascinating study. It says this, that many neuroscientists for decades thought that the brain was actually kind of formed and cemented, or kind of like concrete, once you get out of puberty and once you pass adolescence. But in the recent decades, neuroscientists are actually discovering that our brains are actually more like wet cement. They can change. Doesn't matter how old you get, there's actually the ability to change them. One of the thought leaders in this space is a Christian lady named Dr. Caroline Leaf. And in her book, Switching on the Brain, she says this about the benefits of prayer. She said it this way: it has been found that 12 minutes of daily focused prayer over an 8-week period can change the brain to such an extent that it can actually be measured on a brain scan. Fascinating that just simply taking maybe 12 minutes a day just to stop and be still and present with Jesus has such a powerful impact on the brain that you can actually notice the difference on a brain scan. So when it comes to anxiety, I think Paul, the Apostle Paul, was onto something. I think he knew that when it comes to anxiety, if we were just to stop and pray, not just pray, throw up a petition, but be content to just pause and be with Jesus, it could have a dramatic impact on our lives. Not only did Paul say this, but Jesus himself said this as well. He said that when we abide in him, he said this, he said, if you remain in me and I remain in you, you will bear much fruit. He said, when you just practice my presence, when you just pause to be with me consistently all throughout the day, in the midst of an email that you're writing, in the midst of a drive that you're taking, in the midst of a conversation that you're having, if you just practice remaining in me, practice the awareness of my presence, Jesus said you're going to bear much fruit. The Apostle Paul gave us exactly what that fruit looks like. He said this in Galatians. He said, when it comes to the fruit of the Spirit, it's love, it's joy, it's peace, it's forbearance, it's kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. When I think about anxiety and I think of the opposite of what I would like to have in my life, this is the list of things that come to my mind. And Jesus is saying that if you just practice being with me, if you remain in me, if you abide in me, you're going to bear much fruit. And Paul would say, if you want to overcome anxiety, if you want to have this kind of fruit in your life, he would say it's the prayer and petition with thanksgiving that will allow you to experience the peace of God that transcends all your understanding, and it will guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. Imagine the difference. Imagine with me for a moment the difference that just practicing the presence of Jesus in your life, maybe for a minute or two in the morning, or maybe middle of the afternoon, or maybe pausing before you go to bed at night, not to throw up a petition, but just to simply be with Jesus. Imagine the difference that could make with the anxiety that you experience in your world. I have a beautiful picture that I want to share with you this morning as we wrap up our time together. A couple of weeks ago, we celebrated Father's Day. This is my dad who lives in Hanoi in Vietnam. And my dad, about 15 years ago, was first diagnosed with cancer and had a battle with cancer for about a year or two, overcame that battle with cancer through a lot of treatment and a lot of medical procedures. And then about 5 years later, he got cancer again for the second time and went through a number of similar procedures, a lot of chemotherapy, actually had a bone marrow transplant, an incredibly painful procedure. But he was able to overcome cancer for the second time, and just an absolute miracle. And then about 5 years ago, I got a phone call from my parents again. They were living in Vietnam during COVID, and we discovered that my dad had actually gotten cancer for a third time and had to go to the United States, have a stem cell transplant, spent a year at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. And I remember asking my dad, "Dad, how do you get through all of these procedures? How do you get through all of the medical treatments? How do you get through every time you get another diagnosis? What's the thing that you do that helps you to stay so calm?" Because every time I would call my dad over the last 15 years, I was shocked. I was stunned by how much peace and contentment he was experiencing, and he was sharing with me in the midst of having cancer 3 times in a row. My dad's response is the same every single time I ask him the question. He says, "Jason, when I'm on the surgery table, or when I'm in the hospital, or when I'm at the doctor's office, every single time I remind myself that I'm not alone. I remind myself of the presence of Jesus in my life every single moment when anxiety comes up." It doesn't take away the cancer. It doesn't take away the pain. It doesn't take away the reality of what he's experiencing. But it allows him not to be anxious in every circumstance. Not because he's just throwing up a petition to heaven, but because he's practicing just being present with Jesus. And so my encouragement to you today is simply this. If you want your anxiety to subside, this is what I've discovered. The key to that is to begin taking time to abide. When my anxiety begins to subside, it's when I begin to take time to abide. And I want to encourage you, the invitation is there for every single one of us. Every moment of the day, doesn't matter what you're experiencing. It could be one of the greatest challenges of your life, or it could be simply somebody cut you off in traffic. Whatever moment it is, Jesus is always available. He's always willing, and he's always there for you in that moment. You just need to simply take time to abide in his presence. I want to invite you to take out your phone. I shared with you a little simple card or some instructions of how to practice silence in your life. We're actually going to put a QR code up on the screen, and you can scan that QR code, put in your email address, and we'll email you that card of how you can begin to practice silence in your life and begin this practice of abiding in Jesus. Because the bottom line is super simple. The bottom line is simply this: when my anxiety begins to subside, it begins as I take time to abide. Let me pray for you this morning. Father, thank you. Thank you for this incredible letter that Paul wrote to us in the midst of difficult circumstances in a prison in Rome. God, thank you for the reminder that when we simply abide in you, practice your presence in prayer, even when we don't have a conversation with you, but we're just content to practice an awareness of your presence. God, I thank you for this incredible miracle that takes place, this thing that transcends our understanding, that we can't even fully grasp or understand, God. But you begin to overcome the anxiety in our lives. God, I pray that you would give each person the wisdom to know what they need to do with what they heard today. And God, I pray that you'd give them the courage to do it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did and you want more Lifepoint content, subscribe to our channel right now. Or if you're in the area around Moreton Bay or Rothwell, head to our service. Sunday, we'd love to see you there. lifepoint.org.au for all the details. We'll see you soon.